Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to this Oxford Union event with Governor Scott Walker. Governor Walker, thank you so much for joining us today. It is an absolute honor to have you.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you as well.
Thank you. So I'd like to kind of start off at the very beginning. You've been involved in politics for a very long time, and you ran for the Wisconsin State Assembly at the age of just 22. When was it that you decided you wanted to get into politics?
Well, that's a great question. I was always a bit of a geek when it comes to history. I loved hearing about the founders of my country and hearing about the history not only of the United States, but really around the world. I was very involved in civics. My parents were very involved in the small town I grew up in. But I always thought I'd go into business. In fact, later in college, I actually worked for IBM to pay my way through school. But there was a program in my senior year of high school, the American Legion, one of the veterans organization, puts on, called Boys State. There's an equivalent for young women called Girls State. And I was selected to be one of the two individuals from that program to go to Washington. And I guess at that point, particularly when Ronald Reagan was president during the 1980s, I was kind of taken, not so much by politics, but really by the public service, not only the people who were in government at the time, but particularly the veterans and the educators who were involved with the program, actually running the program we were in, just had such a devotion to God and country, to the things that so many of our ancestors had fought for, that I was very much taken by that. And then years later, as you mentioned, in my 20s, there was an opening in the state legislature. And a number of my friends said, hey, you talk about this stuff, you know about this stuff, why don't you run? And I did. Oddly enough, I actually thought something many of you listening as students might be surprised to learn, not just in politics, but probably in business as well, that my contemporaries, the people in my age bracket, had the bigger problem with my age than most of the older voters. People in their 50s, 60s, 70s at the time actually thought it was kind of nice to have somebody young and energetic who was interested. So it was more my own age group that thought we couldn't do it. It wasn't the people a tad older than us.
I think that leads us really nicely onto the YAF and your current work with the YAF, because the YAF really is an organization that tries to get young people involved in politics and involved in conservatism. What do you see as the future of conservatism in the United States? Do you believe it's bright? And what role do you think the YAF is going to play in shaping that?
Yeah, I do. And there's a bunch of other things that's okay to peel that question apart in a couple different directions. One, as you mentioned, the history of our founding of YAF goes all the way back to William F. Buckley in 1960 in his home in Sharon, Connecticut. And we still use the Sharon principles, the principles that were created at that gathering of young people at William F. Buckley's home. And the idea was really not just about conservative, but about freedom, about economic, religious, personal freedoms, and being at the core of that. And so Young America's Foundation, as we're named today, we're a nonprofit, so we're not a political organization, but we do talk about conservative ideas, but in the larger context, free enterprise, individual liberties, strong national defense, kind of those traditional core values. And I think to the heart of your question, I would say from that standpoint, the conservative movement is doing quite well in many regards, despite the obvious question saying, hey, wait a minute, look at the presidential election, look at the makeup of the US House and the United States Senate. And I'd say, well, the counter to that is in the 2000 elections, November of last year. If you look, and I'm biased because I came from state government, but the states where I think most of the action is, the vast majority of state lawmakers, in fact, every state that had a Republican legislative majority maintained it, and 3 more chambers were added. There was a net gain of an additional Republican governor. And so overwhelming majorities in the state houses, majority when it comes to Republican governors, certainly in Washington, with a Democrat president and a Democrat majority in the House and the Senate. But even there, because of the filibuster rules, there's not a lot that can be done without consensus there. So at least for the next 2 years, you probably have a fair amount of gridlock, but in the states, you have great action. The final thing I would just add, and this is where it really ties into Young America's Foundation, is I believe it's a ripe opportunity. I'm an optimist, which probably isn't surprising because I came of age under Ronald Reagan, who didn't just make me a Republican or a conservative, but really an optimist. He had an eternal belief in the American people, and I share that. But when I look right now, not having a single personality like President Trump or anyone else for that matter, kind of the dominant figure in the conservative movement, but rather kind of wide open, it gives us a great opportunity to get back to the basics, to talk about the contrast between freedom, what it means to have free speech, free association, free enterprise, freedom, and contrast that with socialism, which in many ways is the direct contrast with that. And I think that's a great time to have a battle of ideas, not just of personalities.
Absolutely. And I before we kind of touch upon President Trump and the recent events and also his future, I thought I'd kind of direct to the recent announcement that former Vice President Pence is joining the YAF. What role is he going to have, and how excited are you about that?
Yeah, we just had a discussion with our staff not too long ago, earlier today, and we just announced it literally a week ago. So it's brand new. Mike Pence, our 48th Vice President of the United States, will now be a Ronald Reagan Presidential Scholar. It's really a combination of things. He's going to be doing somewhat traditional things like a monthly column, non-traditional, maybe at least in years past, but a weekly podcast for us, which is timely because YAF years ago actually sponsored Ronald Reagan's radio broadcast back before he was president of the United States. So some interesting history there. And Mike Pence, before he was vice president, before he was governor, before he was in Congress, he actually was a radio host. So even though podcast is not the same as radio, there aren't typically a lot of commercial breaks, there is a ripe opportunity for him to speak out about the things I just mentioned, talking about freedom, what the contrasts are, give some of his insights. And then he'll be doing a series of speeches on college campuses, which we're thrilled with because we think, again, that's really the core of having a great and vigorous debate about the future of not just the conservative movement, but really the future of our country and where it stands in the world. So we're thrilled with that. We think it's a great fit. The only other group he's associated with in a similar way is the Heritage Foundation, which also has a long-standing tradition of being kind of the premier think tank on the conservative movement here in the United States.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned earlier President Trump. In the absence of President Trump, there wouldn't really be any single thought leader in the party. Do you think that what role do you think President Trump is going to play going forward in the Republican Party and in politics generally? Do you think he's going to maybe reemerge as sort of a thought leader, or do you think it might go to someone else, perhaps Vice President Pence, perhaps another current US politician? Or do you think we might, in fact, get a surprise candidate emerge like we did in 2016 in the form of Donald Trump?
Well, I think with Donald Trump, anything is possible. I saw that firsthand as a presidential candidate. Every time I thought there was no way he could go forward after some of the things that had happened or said, he constantly surprised me. So I wouldn't be surprised with anything when it comes to Donald Trump. In fact, I used to say about 5-6 years ago, the only thing predictable about Donald Trump was that he was unpredictable. So in that vein, I would say, I think it's really up in the air, although part of that unpredictability has been obviously significantly altered. And by that, I mean, he really others had used it over the past decade in particular, but no one perfected the use of Twitter, for example, and other means of social media, but particularly Twitter, the way that he did. He found a way to do an in-round around the traditional media outlets to talk directly to the American people, and then to affect even traditional media outlets by what he said on Twitter, being banned by that, which appears to be a long-term ban, although who knows? Again, everything's unpredictable. They may decide whether you're on the left or the right. It's not quite as interesting, whether you love him or hate him or somewhere in between on Twitter as it was when he was driving a lot of the responses all across the ideological spectrum. But to the heart of your question, I think he's got to figure out what he wants to do. A couple of years is an eternity, at least in American politics. I think he probably plays a significant role in the 2022 elections. He could very well help Republicans regain the House, which, remember, all the talk was just 6 months ago was how there was going to be this massive blue wave in America, that Republicans were going to lose anywhere from 15 or more seats in the House. They actually gained seats, not enough to win the majority back, but after the next election, which, as an aside, I should say, with all the states that are controlled by Republican legislatures, that's really significant because not all, but most states determine their congressional boundaries after the census, which has just been conducted. Those new lines will be used in the 2022 election. And so most states, those boundaries will be drawn by Republican-led legislative bodies. So just drawing relatively fair maps means you're going to have some really competitive seats out there. I think former President Trump will try and be engaged in that. May have an impact on the U.S. Senate, although I think with some of the retirements, that's a little bit more up in the air. But where he goes in the future, obviously, if he runs, he's the 800-pound gorilla in the room in the sense that he can control more attention, more passion, good and bad, than anybody else. But I think he's got to decide if that's what he wants to do. He may find after a few years he likes being a private citizen again and doesn't want to have to deal with all the grief. And if that's the case, then it really is wide open. Mike Pence, Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, any number of governors, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, the governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, any number of other individuals in the Senate and otherwise, I think would be viable candidates if Donald Trump's not in the mix.
Do you think any of them would, or many of them rather, would choose not to run if President Trump did stand for re-election in 2024?
I do, and some of it depends on, and this is something I can speak firsthand, again, having been one of 17 candidates for president. In fact, at the time, I joke about this. People say, why'd you get out? I said, well, I wisely got out before I got a nickname. Everybody else got nicknames. I didn't have a nickname. That's not obviously the reason why I got out. But when I got out in September of 2015, when we suspended the campaign, a lot of people were shocked because we were still pretty high in the polls a week or two before at the second presidential debate amongst Republicans. I think I was either third or fourth in the polls. We could see, though, in that debate, 3-hour debate, I was, near the top of the polls. And in that debate, I think I got 2 questions. And that was because the media, and it didn't matter which outlet, whether it's Fox or CNN or others, they were completely consumed with Donald Trump, for good or for bad. That's all they wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the future of the country and the challenges that we faced, and just realized, unless I stood on my head at the next debate, and even then, it might not have guaranteed enough attention, that we weren't going to break through, which is why I think your question's a perfect one. I think there will be a number of those would-be candidates who probably don't get in, but some of it depends on the lane, if you will. One of the interesting things about American politics, particularly in the primary and caucus season, is it's not just who's the best candidate, but who can weave their way through this process, and who's the competitors within their lane. I had, when I got out, generally pretty positive ratings across the board, which again would seem counterintuitive to get out. But the reality was, whether you were a social conservative, an economic conservative, whether you were a military hawk, all those different coalitions generally had a good feeling about me and what I had done as governor and the positions I was taking. But he often was paired with 1 or 2 other candidates. With Donald Trump, his supporters early on just were solely a Donald Trump scam. And I think that's, he found a unique camp that was unlike anyone else. There's a great movie, probably none of you remember unless you're into nostalgia. When I was a kid, it was called Spinal Tap. It was a spoof of a rockumentary, like a documentary about a fake English rock band. And they used to joke in the movie about their amps would go up not just to 10, but up to 11. And he'd say, well, 11's a little bit more. And I said, that's what Donald Trump was. He was the 11. He would take the things we talked about and just ramp it up a little bit more than others. And I think that's precisely why he won in 16 in the primaries and why he would be a dominant figure if he chose to run again in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth asking. What was it like to debate Donald Trump?
Well, it was interesting because a couple of those times I was right next to him. Oddly enough, when there was a commercial break, he's a very collegial guy, was decent to talk to, even going in and out of debates in the green room. He'd talk about how my kids were or things like that. So he was actually, oddly enough, quite attentive to other people. But man, and you could see his years of being on Celebrity, he could turn it on. He completely got into his zone. And usually, again, the media was so taken by that that you almost had to wave a flag and get their attention on anything else. It is what it is. I'm not complaining about it, but it was very much an interesting dynamic, and it took others longer to figure that out than it took me. I just realized after a couple debates in that I wasn't going to waste the time of my supporters when I could see where things were headed. Now, in the end, I ended up supporting him, even though I didn't really know what to expect, and never having been in office before. Back when I suspended my campaign, I actually talked about the need for other conservatives to consider doing what I had done and kind of rally around a single optimistic conservative voice. Many people, without me saying the name, thought that was about Donald Trump. I got to say, when I look at the last 4 years, he actually surprised me on substance, on policy. As a conservative, I thought he did exceptionally well. Obviously, on occasion, there were tweets or comments or actions he took that certainly don't relate to who I am. And I always had the best defense when someone would ask in the media. I'd say, well, he wasn't my first pick. and of course, I'd say I was my first pick. But when I looked at what he had to offer and what Hillary Clinton had to offer, and even in this last election, what Joe Biden had to offer, I just knew on the substance, on the policy, that was ultimately what mattered, not just what you say or tweet. And that's where I ended up in that camp. But it was very, very interesting being not only in those debates, but other campaign activities.
Yeah, it's also kind of before my next question, though, I'd like to remind all our members, do ask questions. Drop your question using the Q&A function below. So yeah, we can get your questions directly to Governor Walker. I was wondering what you think the one thing would be, if there was one thing you would change about your presidential campaign, about the way you ran it, about what you did, what would that be?
I'd win. I'd win. That's what I'd change. I say that only half sarcastically. I mean, to do that, I still think, looking back, it would have been really, really difficult in terms of just the fascination the media had. And, because, I mean, again, no matter what your opinion is of Donald Trump, it's hard to deny not only as president, but over the past 30, 40 years, this guy globally has been one of the masters in marketing. And so, I mean, he's really been able, whether it's his businesses, his shows, his entertainment, I mean, he's just done remarkable things in terms of marketing. And he applied those skills to running for president. Having said that, I don't know that it would have changed just because I think he had such a head start in that regard, not just in terms of what he did, but in terms of perception with the media. But I think, looking back, it probably, here I had been a governor, I'd been reasonable, I'd been calm, I'd been bold. It didn't mean I wasn't aggressive in terms of my policies, but coming from the Midwest, we call it Midwest nice. We're kind of calm and reserved about it. I probably should have been a bit more aggressive, and that might have had an impact. But again, I think looking at the circumstances, I don't lose sleep over it. Just personally, as a Christian, I just figure it wasn't God's will. But if I had to do anything other than, as I joked, win, but to win probably would have required being a bit more aggressive than we were at the time.
Yeah. Before kind of talking a bit more about what has been going on in terms of national politics, I'd like to touch upon your time as governor.
Sure.
And one of the more controversial, let's say, parts of your tenure was the Wisconsin budget repair bill. Why do you think it was something that was important for Wisconsin? And did you expect the reaction that it got?
No, that's a great and timely question. Yesterday was 10 years ago to the day that we introduced the budget repair bill. And in the states, unlike the US federal government, we actually have to have a balanced budget. Obviously, the federal government, regardless of party, sadly, hasn't had that for quite some time. But in Wisconsin specifically, any governor, not just me, anytime the amount of expenditures and revenues exceed a certain gap, by law, the governor at that moment is required to propose to the legislature what's called a budget repair bill. When I looked at our options, and after we got elected in 2010, we started planning for this, and we found in meeting with the state budget committee or budget team, the staff there, that it was far worse than it had been publicly laid out. We had about a $3.6 billion gap in the budget and a deficit in the existing budget we inherited. And so we looked at our options. And, there were things like to get to that budget being balanced, I probably would have had to lay off anywhere from 10 to 15,000 public employees. And why I wanted limited government, to me, you don't get there through just random pink slips. You get there through managed reform. I could have cut billions of dollars from Medicaid. And even though I wanted to have fewer people dependent on the government, again, you have to have time and a plan to do that, and a plan to help grow the economy to take those people off of welfare. And so if we just cut billions, that would have hurt needy families and children and seniors. So I didn't do that. I could have raised taxes, but I promised the voters I was not going to do that. And probably equally as important, at that point with really high unemployment, pouring a gigantic tax increase on the people in my state would have been like putting a wet blanket on the economy. So the only really big ticket item left was aid to local government. Now, I had been the elected county executive before being governor, so I'd seen firsthand the year before, the Democrat governor and the legislature controlled by Democrats at the time had cut aid to local governments because, again, like we inherited, there was an economic and budget crisis going on, not only in Wisconsin, but across the country. And the difference is they cut aid, but they didn't give us any tools. So the reason why, to the heart of your question, not only why we did the budget repair bill, but why we included the changes in what's commonly called collective bargaining, was I knew if we were going to alter what the state gave to schools and local governments, we need to give those locally elected leaders the tools to offset that so as not to devastate the programs and services they provide. And that's exactly what we did.
Yeah. And when the bill was passed, obviously, and during the procedure of passing it, there was a lot of controversy and a bit of a backlash as well. Did you really expect that reaction?
No, I didn't. When I was the Milwaukee County executive, Milwaukee's about a 60-40 liberal versus conservative county. So I had been somewhat prepared for this because there was always pushback. When I was the county executive, I'd never raised the property tax levy from the previous year. So there was some pushback from some of the government-run unions and some of the more liberal members. So I knew there'd be some pushback, but I had no idea. I mean, it started out the first night 10 years ago with about a couple hundred people. By the following day, or by the following week, that was a Friday, by the following Monday, I think there was about 1,000. Within a week, 14 Senate Democrats left the state to block a vote because even though they didn't have a majority required to have a quorum, well, we knew at that point something had changed because suddenly the numbers just escalated. We went from hundreds and thousands to tens of thousands. And at one point, there was about 100,000 people occupying our state capitol and our state square. In fact, I often joke, but it's true. The Occupy Wall Street movement did not start on Wall Street. It started on my street about 7 or 8 months before it did on Wall Street. And so the idea was these national groups, the unions and other liberal groups came in and just said, we're going to block this. We're going to try and intimidate the Republican lawmakers who were considering this. There were threats against them. There were death threats against me, against my family. I mean, I think at one point there was even a threat passed on to me that said they were going to gut my wife like a deer. They mentioned knowing where my kids went to school. They went to government-run schools. It was just a really tense and ugly time. But in the end, we prevailed, and we were so much the better off for it. But it was shocking at the time as to how that happened.
Mm-hmm. So What would you say was your most proud achievement during your time as governor?
Well, I think when I mentioned with what we did with what's called Act 10, our reforms, sorry about that. During my time as governor, I think the biggest thing wasn't just Act 10 and the budget repair bill. It was the fact that the bigger changes we made were long-term changes. We didn't just put duct tape over this, but we made it into long-term structural reform. And the simplest way I explain is we took the power out of the hands of the big government special interest and put it firmly into the hands of the hardworking taxpayers and the people they duly elect. So school board members, members of city councils, municipal governments, county boards, all the people who are elected at the local level now could make those decisions. And I'll give you a good example. The year before I was governor, I mentioned there were cuts to local governments, including schools. Well, one of the people who was the first to be laid off was a young woman named Megan Sampson, who was one of the first one of the people in the state, I should say, not only one of the first to be laid off. She was one of the people, a new teacher to our largest school district, Milwaukee. She was named the outstanding new English teacher for the entire state of Wisconsin. A few weeks later, she gets a pink slip telling her that she's being laid off. Why? Under the old union contracts, the last hired is the first fired. The last in is the first out. We changed all of that. And that means that schools and others, but particularly schools, can staff based on merit. They can pay based on performance. That means they can put the best and the brightest in their classrooms and keep them there.
Yeah, and what would you have done differently as a governor?
Well, that's a great question, because I think coming in, I was so eager to fix things, I didn't talk about it. Because most politicians talk about it, but they don't fix anything. That's true at any level of government, at least here in the United States, but I would imagine around the world. And so I just came in, I talked about it. I literally ran a TV ad about pension and healthcare contributions. I'd made some other changes, but in the end, I didn't really talk about it once I got in office. I learned from that point going forward that I had to talk about. When I told the stories of Megan Sampson, as I just mentioned, or when I talk about the correctional officers in the union who'd come in and call in sick, and then they'd come in the next shift and earn time and a half. When I talk about the old man, retired guy who wanted to be a crossing guard in one of our school districts, but couldn't because the union said he had to be paid so he could be a union member. Overwhelmingly, people said, that's outrageous. You got to fix that. You got to do something about it. But I hadn't done that early on. So if I could do it over again, I would say, and I think it's true in life in general, don't stop communicating. No matter how many times you've talked about it, not just talk, but explain to people why you're doing things as opposed to just what you're doing. And I think this past year, literally during this global pandemic, that advice has probably been never more valuable than it is now. Too many levels of government, regardless of ideological belief, spend their time talking about what they expected people to do instead of explaining why. And I think that's why, depending on where you're at, we've had very diverse or kind of extreme reaction to how people dealt with this global pandemic. That's something I learned a decade ago. You got to talk about the why, not just the what, and you got to explain it over and over again.
We've recently seen some disturbing events. It's been a bit of a tumultuous time. We saw the allegations made by President Trump over the result of the election. We saw the storming of the US Capitol, and then we saw, and now we've currently got ongoing, rather, an impeachment process. What do you think of President Trump's allegations regarding the election? Do you think that voter fraud occurred? And if not, why do you think President Trump made these allegations?
Well, I think there's a number of different pieces to it. In terms of the impeachment, I think there's a lot of Americans, again, regardless of party, who are still scratching their head asking why in the world is there an impeachment process going on for someone who's no longer in office? You've heard a number of senators raise that. I think I carry in my pocket a copy of the U.S. Constitution. And it's interesting. People actually, and I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think you need to be a lawyer to read it. It's pretty simple. It's in two different sections of the U.S. Constitution. For example, it's why the Chief Justice, who a year ago presided over the proceedings in the Senate, is not there today, this week, because in the Constitution, it clearly says the Chief Justice presides over an impeachment involving the president. Donald Trump's a private citizen. He's no longer the president. The other part is it clearly talks about the judgment, if the Senate were to convict, is about removal from office and disqualification from running again, not and or. And so I think a lot of people look at that and say, okay, he's already out. You really can't do, and he's no longer going to be removed from office. But I think on a practical sense, not just on the looking at the words of the Constitution, I also think there's a lot of people here in America who just think, hey, we're still not out of the woods on COVID. We still got problems with kids going back to schools. We still got tremendous challenges with the economy, particularly from small businesses and restaurants and taverns and others. Maybe Congress and the Senate should be focused on that. So in one part, that's just your question on impeachment. On the other stuff, what happened on January 6th, I absolutely denounced. I denounced the moment it was brought to my attention, just as I had all summer denounced the violence in many of the cities across the United States. And I think there was a distinction. There were peaceful protesters in many US cities who raised, I think, legitimate concerns about some of the things that had been seen. At the same time, there were people who went way off the deep end and started burning down buildings and squad cars and attacking folks. And I denounced that then, just as I denounced the people that stormed the Capitol and resorted to violence. Now, I don't think they represented most of the people who showed up at the rally for the president, but that's very similar to what I faced 10 years ago. There were 100,000 people in and around our Capitol. Most of them were very passionate, but most of them were not violent. But we did have episodes, sadly, much like the US Capitol, where people did crack windows and crawl in through windows and take down doors and overrun the Capitol Police in our state capitol at the time. It was wrong then, just as it was wrong last summer, just as it was wrong at our US Capitol. And on the final part of your question, the part in terms of voter irregularities, I think I can't speak for every allegation they made. I do know in the case of Wisconsin, for example, I just gave the facts and pointed out that the concerns they raised about absentee ballots people do by mail if they make a request for an absentee ballot. The state law in a couple instances clearly was not followed. Whether or not that constitutes outright fraud it has to be debated. But for example, the law says as a voter, if you ask for an absentee ballot, you've got to print your name, your address, and sign it, as does a witness. There were many voters who did not print in their address and other people filled them in. That's not allowed under the state law. Is that a technical mistake or is it a violation of the law? That's in the mind of the beholder on this, but that's what the state law says. Probably a more specific one is state law says you have to ask for an absentee ballot in writing. And in the case of two of the largest counties, they held up public events at parks where they just handed out absentee ballots. And that clearly violates the statutes. So in those cases, they were right to say that there were votes cast that didn't directly follow the law. The problem, as I mentioned as well, there is why I validated that concern. I said the dilemma that people on the other side of the political equation didn't fully appreciate either was, what's the remedy? How do you resolve that? Once someone votes by absentee ballot, it's kind of like spitting in the ocean. You can't distinguish a ballot that may not have correctly been done with a ballot that was correctly done. You have to randomly take them out if that was going to be a remedy. And then rightfully so, if I voted correctly, I'm saying, hey, wait a minute, my vote, could randomly be taken out as well. So there's just a lot of problems. And the most important thing is going forward, they need to correct them. I think they can. Remember 20 years ago, well, you may not remember, but others, I remember 20 years ago in Florida, there was a very much a disputed election results between George W. Bush and Al Gore at the time. Florida was looked at as an absolute mess. 20 years later, they were one of the models because they made some real significant changes to improve the electoral process.
Thank you. So I think that really kind of, lets us lead on to the next question, which is, about the current state of US politics, because over the last 4 years, we've just seen the temperature raise massively. We've seen a lot of violence, ranging from what happened at the Capitol to what happened last summer to before that. For example, when congressmen were shot during practice for a baseball game, and there's just various examples. The temperature has been going up, not going down. Where do you see this leading in the future? What do you think should be done about it?
Well, it's a big concern, and it's one I say often to younger people, and I would say not just in the United States, but around the world, because one of the things I attribute to is media and social media. And again, I'm not targeting one way or the other. I think from MSNBC to Fox and everything in between, cable news in particular, most of the voices, and I occasionally show up on all of those networks, but some of the people who are just on one or the other often are the most loud, most over the top, most aggressive folks that are involved. And so they drive to that audience even more so. And this is where I invoke young people. I think social media, particularly Twitter, and I'm on Twitter, I'm not giving it up. I'm not going to concede something that allows me to communicate messages. You know, I'm in other stuff just did a presentation on YouTube last night on our YF TV channel. We use that and Instagram and you name it, Facebook and all the above. But I do think, particularly on Twitter, one of the challenges is that the voices that are amplified are the ones that are the most obnoxious. And again, I mean across the political spectrum, and even in business and sports and entertainment. For people to be trending, it usually means either they or someone saying something really outrageous about them. And that's not where most people in America and where most people in the world are at. Most people are problem solvers. They have beliefs, and I'm not saying I'm a conservative, so I'm not ceding that. But I think part of the reason I did well as governor was more than just Republicans, more than just conservatives. Average citizens saw me as a problem solver, which is why I was elected 3 times. And I think that's missing. That I think that only exacerbates things. You see it in the reaction to the election results, as you mentioned. You saw it in the reaction even when the gunman came, looking for Republican members of Congress on that baseball field. In each of those cases, it's absolutely obnoxious. It's outrageous. It has to be denounced. But when you take things to those extremes, unstable people are often going to take them completely out of context and do bad things. So we've got to find a way. I've always felt you can be respectful and passionate at the same time. You can have a passionate belief in the things you stand for, whether it's in politics, in terms of your religious beliefs, in terms of your business practices, whatever it might be. You can be passionate about it. But the most important thing, my kids are 25 and 26. My wife, Tonette, and I always tried to teach them to be respectful. And if we have respect for each other, we can have those passionate debates without leading to not just physical violence, but some of the chaos that we see certainly in America and other parts of the world.
Right. So I think that kind of really helps us mesh nicely onto the next question, because the whole raising of the temperature was, and the promotion of hate and those sorts of things was used by social media companies, and we kind of chatted about this earlier as well, as a justification for removing several people, most prominently President Trump, but others as well, and banning them from their platforms. Do you think it's a reasonable justification, or do you think this borders on censorship? And does it show that perhaps the amount of power that these companies have has gone a bit too far and needs to be reined in?
Well, I think it is too far. I think that's why I even saw a number of leaders in Europe who aren't necessarily aligned with Donald Trump speak out about this as well, because I think it sets a dangerous precedent, particularly at the time when Donald Trump was president of the United States. Again, whether you agree with him or not, in general, I'm all for free speech. I'm a fierce advocate, whether it's on campus, in culture, in communications. I think it's incredibly important that that we hear from voices that we don't necessarily agree with. Both of my kids went to colleges that wouldn't necessarily be viewed as conservative. They both came out reasonably conservative, but it was, I thought it was appropriate, as did my wife, for them to be exposed to all different ideas, to have debates, to have discussions, to be passionate about it. But for what I just said, to be respectful about it as well. Obviously there are times when I differ with President Trump in terms of style, and I would probably say or tweet things a little bit differently. But the idea that people can just be shut out, I think is really, really dangerous, even if I don't always agree with their comments or their tone. I just think that's incredibly dangerous. And I think it's inconsistent. I mean, when they took President Trump off, I think they were still allowing, the leader of Iran to be on, one of the largest state sponsors of, or one of the countries largely around state-sponsored terrorism. I just think it's inconsistent. But we're seeing it now, not just with big tech. I mean, Disney, just this week, Let's Go, one of their actors in The Mandalorian, and yet you can look at one of her co-stars saying some very similar things, but from a more liberal perspective, invoking some of the things that happened tragically during Nazi Germany to make a point. To me, with all these things, I just think there's got to be consistency. And for that matter, I should just say as an aside, it shocks me that Disney is invoking any sort of moral authority when they filmed the movie Mulan, the live action film, in China, a country that I think is pretty universally seen to have internment or concentration camps for religious minorities, where they're just doing unspeakable things. And some have even called it genocide. And they have no problem thanking them for their assistance in doing that movie, but yet someone tweets this and they immediately react. I just think that's the sort of thing that really makes it difficult. One last thing I would just add, and this is why I think we need more information, not less. One of the other things I think goes into that same double standard concern when it comes to the traditional media outlets in America, and that is, I think that, once upon a time, and I know this sounds, I'm not a boomer, but it sounds like a boomer statement. Once upon a time, the media at least was kind of this factual foundation from which we could then interpret the news. Well, because the news is kind of taken on its own, if you're Fox or Newsmax, it's conservative. If you're CNN or MSNBC, it's more liberal. The problem then becomes people interpret things. They listen to the news that fits their beliefs instead of getting the facts consistent and then interpreting them according to their beliefs. And I think that's really dangerous because, then people start, some of these concerns about conspiracy theories or other things come because there's an increasingly large level of disbelief with traditional media sources.
I think that really kind of puts things into perspective. And I'd like to ask a couple more questions before we move into the questions submitted from our members. So again, if you've got a question for Governor Walker, please do pop it into the Q&A function in the chat. That would be excellent. So this question's really more about you. What do you see your future role being in the US political sphere? And will you perhaps run for office again? Are you going to, do your role with the YAF long time? What do you see it as being?
Well, the good news is I'm a quarter century younger than Joe Biden. So I got plenty of time. Actually, for that matter, I'm considerably younger than former President Donald Trump as well. Obviously, both men well into their 70s. One of my heroes, Ronald Reagan, I remember back when I was a kid, there were some of his critics who said he was too old. Joe Biden was older than Ronald Reagan was at the end of his term when he was sworn in. So there's plenty of time out there. My purpose, at least, I've got a contract for at least 4 years with Young America's Foundation. I presume if things go well, I'll be there longer than that. But the reason I'm there is because I know if you're going to make positive change in this country, it's got to start with young people. It's got to start in our college campuses and in our culture. It's got to have an impact there. And so I really firmly believe that that's a higher calling at least at this time, than running for office. Whether or not, I ever run again, it's hard to completely shake that idea. And again, when you look at both Trump and Biden, they have clearly changed the bar in terms of what age you can be and still effectively run for office.
Yeah, your
that sounded like
about...
a political answer in the sense that I didn't tell you a date, but one thing I can be certain is I'm not running in 2022. That would be the year I could run for re-election as governor or election as governor. And I'm not running for the U.S. Senate, even though there's a possibility that there'll be an opening in 2022. I don't anticipate running for president in 2024, but at some point in the future, it all depends. If I feel like there's better candidates, I'm going to defer to them. If I feel someday like I've got some that, not just that I could offer, but part of the reason why I ran in a county I mentioned that's about 2-to-1 Democrat and won was there was a big scandal many, many years ago. And I was outraged. My kids, Tonette and I were raising at that time young kids in a county that I thought was being disserved by the leadership there. And I felt an obligation to step up and run. So that might happen again. Never say never.
Yeah, your point about President Reagan made me remember that debate he had with Walter Mondale and his little comment about the way he kind of flipped the question, talking instead about Walter Mondale's youth and inexperience. But
it was a brilliant line. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, it's hard not to say that was one of the most classic lines of all time, because and Reagan was really exceptional. Part of the reason why I liked him, it tied into his optimism, was he was able to use humor to not only make his point, but really to diffuse situations like that, which, like a lot of presidents, he wasn't unique. This happened to George W. Bush. It actually happened to Barack Obama, where the first debate of their reelection, they were a little rusty. Some people wondered if that meant he was too old to handle the circumstances. And when he delivered that line, boy, it just, even Mondale laughed at it because it was well delivered. And it's a little bit of why I joked about being a quarter century younger than Joe Biden. It's true, but it's also kind of funny. It reminds you, yeah, guys like me and younger obviously had plenty of time to run for office.
Yeah, I think that kind of really puts things into perspective again. And I'd like to ask you a question before we move on to questions from our audience that we're asking every speaker this term. What is the one thing we are not talking about that we should be talking about?
Debt. I'd say particularly in the United States, but I think it's probably true around the world. When I was a kid, like I said, when Ronald Reagan was first president, the national debt in the United States was about $1 trillion. And that was pretty big at the time. Today in the United States, the interest payments on the debt alone exceed $1 trillion. Going into 2020, I was worried the national debt in the United States was going to exceed $23 trillion. It's well on its way to 30 trillion by the end of this year. And, you say, okay, federal government can print money. What does that really mean? Well, at some point, it starts to eat up and consume so much of your budget. If you look at not just debt to GDP, but you look at, what are your expenses versus what are your revenues versus what your debt is. That's a really troubling issue if you don't get this under control. Obviously, anyone in college who knows anything around the world, for that matter, about student loan debt, knows that that's a real issue and a real concern. At least in the United States, the average student loan debt is about a quarter of what most of us are going to have to pay off just when it comes to our share of the federal debt in the United States. So that's a real concern, and very few, if anybody, certainly neither of the presidential candidates talked about it this last fall, because it's not sexy. It's not pleasant. But at some point, I talked about it, 10 years ago. The reforms we put in place led to the fact that in Wisconsin, for 8 years, the full 8 years I was in office, we had a surplus every year. But it wasn't just about balancing budgets. That sounds okay. That's, how exciting is that? But because of that, and because we did it through reforms, not just cuts, because typically that's been the mistake, whether it's Republican or Democrat, Labor or Tory. A lot of times you hear a conservative, liberal, one side wants to spend more, the other side wants to cut. What we did was neither. our reforms changed the way that we ran government, so that, yes, we didn't spend as much, but because of our reforms, state and local leaders could actually put more of those dollars more effectively into the programs our citizens wanted, whether it was schools or local and state government as well.
Thank you very much for that. We're now going to move on to some questions from our audience. So we've received one from anonymous attendee on a topic we kind of discussed earlier. And they ask, surely Disney and Twitter as private companies have a right to do whatever they want in the interest of protecting their brands. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on essentially, your view of the need to ensure that everyone is able to, have a right to their opinions, whilst also protecting the First Amendment rights of these companies?
Right. No, I think that's a great question and great insights. And thank you for giving me a chance to expound that a little bit. There are some people, particularly some conservatives in Congress, who want the government to take action. I want to make it abundantly clear. I do not want the government to take action in any way to impede the right of not only a private business, but a private individual from being able to restrict. If you want to block me from commenting on your Twitter, that's your right. I may not like that. I may publicly denounce that, particularly if it's an elected or high profile individual, but that person, just like that company, has every right to do that. Two things, though, come to mind. One, specifically here in the United States, when it comes to social media platforms, there was in a law passed many years ago, a provision called Section 230, which carves out liability protections for platforms like Facebook, Twitter, other social media outlets like that, that allows them to not have the same sort of liability that other companies or individuals might have for things that are said on their platform. The distinction, though, is they have to operate like a platform. The moment they go from being a platform to a publisher is someone who has editorial authority over what's in the content that they allow to go up on their social media platform. Then, to me, then they bear responsibility. Then they're responsible for what's being said, whether or not it's liable, whether or not they're saying things that are inaccurate. If they want to take on that responsibility, it's their right to do that, but they should no longer have the liability protection that comes from being a platform. I think that's a really important point. And there have been some, well, quite a few actually, who have threatened to change that. I think they need to stop threatening and just say, here's the deal. If you want to be a platform and you have very limited, if any, restrictions, and I think there's some reasonable things. A company can say, we don't want profanity, we don't want graphic sex or graphic violence or general things like that. I think those are reasonable limits. But if you start saying we're going to judge whose political thought is more worthy than others and post some and block others, then I think that entity goes very rapidly from a platform into a publisher. And if that's the case, they should not have liability protections. The reality is, practically speaking, a Twitter, for example, couldn't survive with all the people on Twitter if they had to account for taking on that liability. And so I think that the question that was asked is a brilliant one. It's right on the money. But I want to make it clear, I'm speaking out. I actually think if you look over the last decade, there's some pretty nasty, awful things said about me. I don't block people from commenting on any of my social media posts. I actually encourage my wife and my kids not to read them. I haven't read them for about 10 years. It gives me great satisfaction that I often tell not just others in politics, but in media and sports and otherwise, don't read the comments on your social media post because most of them are just really obnoxious, and a good chunk of them are people living in the basements of their parents' home. And have that communication, find other ways to connect with people, but don't let anonymous folks sitting back taking shots at people be what gets in your head and drives you. But they still, at least for me, they have every right to say that, even if I don't pay attention to it.
Awesome. And as we're running short of time, I'm just going to ask one final question. And that's kind of one that really meshes in with the YAF and the youth, really. And it's from Nate Garson, and it's about student debt. And he asks, there's a significant difference between the cost of US universities versus UK universities, with a significant component of that cost in the US not pertaining to education, things such as athletics, various student centers, rec centers, etc. What are your thoughts on reining in the cost of US higher education and holding schools accountable for their spending?
Another brilliant question, and it fits into a couple key areas. For example, when I was governor, not only did we freeze tuition multiple years in a row during my time as governor to try and get that under control, not just the debt, because more important than the amount of debt is keeping the cost reasonable in the first place. But the other part of it ties into the question about fees, not only for sports or use of fitness facilities or even food, but there's all sorts of different clubs and associations that at many both private and government run colleges and universities, there's automatic fees added on that fund all sorts of things that most students don't even ever know about or aren't involved in. And we got rid of those, at least being mandatory. People could choose to be a part of that, but we didn't automatically take that and put that on their tuition bill as a fee added on to their overall tuition and room and board. I think, one, that's critically important because in many of our colleges and universities, they're piling on things that have little or nothing to do with their fundamental education. Secondly, and this goes to a larger point, if I've got my numbers right, I'm thinking back in my mind, but I think since 1978, the level of tuition in the United States has gone up, public and private combined, has gone up about 4 times the rate of inflation. And yet the number of faculty, tenured faculty in undergraduate classes, I think has gone down by about a similar proportion. And so students are paying far, far more than they did decades ago, while they're getting much less attention from tenured professors, at least as undergraduates. And I just think that's fundamentally wrong, but it actually makes a larger point than just college. It goes to my whole point about government is often not the answer to our problems. It's actually often exacerbating the challenges we face. And I'll tell you why. That rate in tuition, a large part of it is it parallels student loan aid assistance from the federal government is almost identical to the increase, the 4 times the rate of inflation increase in tuition we've seen on average in the United States. To me, the theory goes that the colleges and universities, as students are able to take on more debt because they're getting more assistance to help with that, these colleges and universities are oftentimes adding more administrators, more non-direct curriculum-based programs and services, all sorts of other things that drive the cost up under this false premise that, well, but there's more student loan assistance provided. Well, yeah, if you get assistance, but it still takes you 20 years to pay off your debt, who cares if you got more assistance? You shouldn't have had to pay that amount of debt in the first place. So to me, the answer, I'm all for free stuff, but not free tuition and not free all these other things that people like Bernie Sanders talk about. I'm for free speech, free association, free enterprise. These are the things that really are free and are worth fighting for. And I think that's just a reminder. We can't always just think the government's the solution. In many ways, we need to push back and say, boy, what is the core of a quality education? And how do we get back to those basics and charge a reasonable price, not just a reasonable price, but hopefully a price that's reasonable in return for what that student gets when they go out into the workplace and takes on a career and are capable of paying, whether it's upfront or even if they take on some limited debt. Is that something they're going to be able to reasonably pay off over hopefully a limited amount of time?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Governor. I'm afraid that's all the time we have, but I'd like to thank you once again so much for joining us. It's been an absolute honor to have you. And I'd like to thank everyone who's attended today, particularly those who sent in questions. I'm sorry we didn't get time to ask all of them, but we appreciate it very much nevertheless. And Governor, once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. You did a great job. And if people have any questions about our group, yaf.org. yaf.org. We'd love to have you inquire about what we're up to. Have a good day. Good evening, I should say.